Hi there, it's me, Jordan Van Haslo. Welcome to Jordan Van Haslo and Friends live on Hot 702.5 FM Las Vegas. Let's get on with the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Showtime with Jordan Van Haslo and Friends, right here on Hot 702.5 FM Las Vegas. I'm so excited to introduce you to my new friend, Brian Maffitt. He's a visual effects supervisor and technical director at Late Night Cartoons, which is a New York-based animation studio that produced Our Cartoon President and Tuning Out the News and many animated specials for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Films he's worked on include In and of Itself, The Blind Date, and Film of the Sun. He's the founder and creative director of Total Training, working there from 1997 to 2014, producing and presenting thousands of hours of educational content. And I really want to know a lot about this, he designed the Evolution plugins for Adobe After Effects, which were acquired by Adobe and have been part of After Effects since 2000. I think I've told you enough about him. Let's get into the conversation. Welcome, 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 Brian. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jordan. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. So I imagine just looking at your, learning how your background, and you used to work with our friend Jose over here.
I did. Jose and I started with Late Night Cartoons right at the very beginning. I think I was employee number 4. I don't remember if Jose slipped in right in front of me or right behind me, but we were both hired in the same week, I think. We were given the task of building an animation studio from absolutely nothing to create an animated broadcast television show within about 6 months. And if you know anything about the world of animation, you know that the lead time on most animated shows is longer than 6 months once you have the studio put together. So the fact that we were building the engine of the train while we were simultaneously laying down the tracks in front of it like Wallace and Gromit, it was a madcap few months as we put this thing together and built it up. It was also tremendously fun, I have to say. It was a lot of hard work, but that was very exciting.
Well, that's one of those situations where you're like so in it and there's so much to do. I imagine like you can't even think about like, oh my goodness, this is scary, or oh my goodness, like what are we doing? Like you just are just in it, I would imagine.
That is 100% true. And I came out of years and years of being an entrepreneur and paying attention to the price tags of things because we tried to squeeze the absolute most out of what limited budgets we had. And so this was one of the first times I was able to come into a network situation and spend other people's money, which had its advantage. It took me a long time to get used to that, actually, because I always looked for the cheapest routes and the most efficient routes, which is good. But the networks don't really expect you to do that. They just, spend whatever it takes to get it done in time. So we bought a lot of really good machines and we had a whole bunch of identical workstations. So we brought all these animators in and they were all kitted out with exactly the same setup so that if a machine ever went down, they just had to move over one seat to an empty machine and start working again because everything was on a centralized network. It was all very, very efficient and very well organized and extremely inspiring, that place. With all of the artists that we had to work with. Those were good times.
So how long did it take you, or did you ever, or did you really like dive into the idea of spending other people's money? You're like, oh, this.
Yeah, we got to tiptoe through parts of this conversation, I think, because I don't want to necessarily. I mean, the industry changes; it's in the midst of changing right now. But no, I kind of got used to that. By the time we did Tuning Out the News, which I guess was our second full series, and that lasted for 3 seasons. By the time we got to Tuning Out the News, we were kind of inventing things along the way that no one had ever done before, but the things that we had to invent often sort of changed from a week-to-week basis, meaning that the show itself went into production with a lot of questions unanswered, a lot of question marks floating around as to exactly what the show wanted to be, because it was ostensibly a parody of a news show. It was a news show. In fact, we made news. We often got reported on in websites that talk about news shows. And by the way, here's Tuning Out the News, where some cartoon characters interview a conservative person, and they come in unawares of the fact that they're going to be blindsided because we had a full research team and a bunch of people from news who made sure that it really was a real newscast. So they came in with their guard down, and we often got really good interviews out of those situations. But everyone was a different setup, and we went into tuning out the news with the idea that the whole show was going to be motion captured, and we built this motion capture studio where a group of artists could stand around in a semicircle. The talent, the interviewers who all came out of comedy, basically. They were all comedy writers. They would stand around in a semicircle, and they each had a camera and a light pointed at their face. And in the center of the semicircle, up against the wall, was a giant TV screen, and then smaller screens surrounding that. Basically, if you know what a control room looks like at NASA or at a broadcast network, we sort of built that out. And every person had their own monitor to look at that had a little puppet version of themselves so they could watch their performance as they were doing it. And the big screen in the middle had the script, and it was a split screen. And on the right side, it would be the person that they were interviewing. So we might have a senator like Adam Schiff, on screen talking to us live, and we were generating the cartoons in real time for a show that would air that day. So just so everyone is clear, if nobody saw this, we were creating broadcast animation the same day that it was airing. This had
Wow.
never been done before. This had
Wow.
never been done before, and we ended up doing it really well. And that grew out of stuff we learned when we were working on our cartoon president, where we often had weeks or even months to put a show together. But the week of the show, the cold open, we called it, the first 5 minutes, would usually be done that week because it would be topical to news of the week. And then we go to the titles, and then the show would happen. But with tuning out the news, we built out this whole studio for motion capture and all this stuff. And we were coming right up to the release date, the day that we were going to premiere on Comedy Central. And on Thursday of that week, we are informed COVID is shutting us down here in the office, and you have 2 weeks to figure out if we can do this remotely or we're not going to have a show. And so all of the stuff that I just described to you, and all of the equipment and all of the cameras and all of the computers that were built to do that thing, that motion capture thing in that studio, mothballs,
Just
collect dust
stopped.
for the next 4 years. I don't even want to say what that stuff cost, but for the next 2 weeks, we had to scramble to now figure out how to deliver the same idea of a show in a completely different production methodology. And
Yeah.
that meant everybody's in their own locations. They all have to sound good, which is why I sound good, because we learned how to make people sound broadcast quality in their own apartments or houses all around the country. We all figured out ways to sort of get together and record things in Zoom. We use remote software to remote into people's computers. So a sound person would actually call into talent's house and control their computer so they could do the capture for them, remotely, while the person could just focus on performing. Everybody, got together and did the more or less the same thing we did in the studio via Zoom, and we'd record all of the individual audio tracks on individual machines during the course of the interview. And then at the end of it would all get uploaded to a server where our animators, which we had to beef up that team, instead of doing motion captures, now basically we took just the audio to generate automatic lip sync, and then animators performed the whole thing. Again, same day. So we would record this at 10, 11, maybe noon on a given day. By 2 o'clock, all of those audio tracks would be out to 20 different animators. Each of them would be taking, or 10 different animators. Each of them would be handling an individual character, would animate the whole thing. All of those characters would get exported, come together in an editing workstation where the editor would not only have to edit the show, but composite the show in Premiere instead of using After Effects or whatever. They put the whole show together in Premiere in this incredibly complicated timeline, and then hit render. And by 6:30 we deliver this show that was going to basically run that night, and
Wow.
it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. The first season we did these short pieces that aired every night. The second season we recorded 4 pieces during the course of the week, and then it was only on the fourth day that we cut together a longer show, and then that became a weekly show rather than a daily show. We sort of learned that the pressure might not be worth it trying to do it every week. And so we cut back a little bit. But, it worked out great. We learned a lot, and I think we made some pretty good television. We certainly made some pretty good news. It was an incredible team, a great group of people that really were devoted to each of their tasks and getting that show done well. We got an Emmy nomination out of it, so that was nice. And then the strikes happened this past year, and we did not survive the strike. So we were not renewed, and that show is no more.
Was that the first time you've ever worked in news, or do you primarily work? Have you primarily worked in straight entertainment?
Well, unless you count when I was in college and was an actor, I was hired by Davis Kid Booksellers in Memphis, Tennessee, to go to a news station once a week and be this on-screen talent guy who would basically read from a teleprompter a live commercial about whatever books they wanted to sell. And so I'm this really skinny, big head of hair college kid doing that every week. And when I say teleprompter, everybody probably immediately thinks of, if they know what a teleprompter is, they think of your classic computer teleprompter. Well, I'm old, as you can see. Your viewers can't see it, but I'm an old guy. Teleprompters in Memphis in those days were sheets of
A guy
paper
holding a
taped.
poster.
Almost. It was a little more sophisticated than that, but it was written out sheets of paper taped together, run underneath a camera that would then
Mm.
invert the image and do the teleprompter thing on an actual screen. So I was able to look into the camera and nod at a cue card guy next to the camera. But still, it was pretty low tech, but it worked.
Was that exciting? Was that like your first like acting gig, or had you been acting beforehand? Like,
I
like
had
you're
the
like,
little shows in high school and stuff like that, but that was my first professional on-camera broadcast experience. I was a stage actor for many years. I moved to New York to be an actor. I think you have an acting background as well,
I do.
if I remember some of your interviews. But I moved to New York to there's a coincidence. There's a couple of coincidences in here, actually. I moved to New York to go to Circle in the Square Theater School.
Okay.
In my class at Circle in the Square was a woman named Evie McGee, classmate of mine. She later went on to marry Stephen Colbert.
Oh,
And I ended up working on our cartoon president, and I still to this day work in the Ed Sullivan Theater in a company owned by Stephen Colbert.
that's wonderful.
Um,
But but
and
no,
to be
like you didn't
completely
you.
clear, not because I knew Evie. I didn't get the job
Okay.
because of that.
So you're not like a, what do they call it, nepo baby? You're not.
I'm not a nepo baby in that respect. No. But the other coincidence, of course, is well, not of course. The other coincidence is when I was in college, one of my other jobs was I was a tour guide at Graceland, which is Elvis Presley's old home. And now I work at the Ed Sullivan Theater, which was where Elvis Presley made
His
his famous
hips got him
debut,
in
and
trouble.
the world got to know who he was. So
That's like really wonderful. I love, I talk to a lot of people and I love how those things happen where, you get to a specific point or moment in your life and it's like, oh my goodness, it almost seems as though the universe has been working to kind of prepare me to get to this place. And, all of these things kind of collide or intersect at this particular moment.
yes. And I think I'm grateful to be a person who appreciates those opportunities as well, because I think there may be a lot of people who are like, oh, that's Sullivan Theater. It's an old theater. Who cares? But I absolutely am driven by history, and I started watching old recordings of the Ed Sullivan Show because, it's just marvelous to see shots of the audience and know that that is the same room that it is today that I've been in a million times. And just the rarefied air, the molecules floating around in that space. I'm probably breathing in a little bit of Topo Gigio or a plate spinner or Elvis Presley or the Beatles because, they were in that space.
You make me think of, do you ever see Bullets Over Broadway?
I did see
When
Bullets Over
Diane Weiss
Broadway.
walked into the theater, she's like breathing in all of that's the Clytemnestra. And
Yes. Yes. And by the way, the when I mentioned earlier the studio that we built that is a motion capture studio, that was built in a soundproof room, which is the only like fully soundproof room at the Ed Sullivan Theater that we converted to a soundstage. But that room used to be the screening room for Worldwide Pants, which was David
Letterman's,
Letterman's production company. So whenever he, needed to watch a movie for an upcoming guest or whenever he was screening his TV shows or whatever, he had this theater built in there in this soundproof room with these giant speakers and this beautiful screen and a projector. There's a, projector wall behind you with the windows in it and everything. And that's our still our audio recording space. So again, rarefied air.
yeah, and just knowing that you are, whether anyone knows it or not, you are now a part of just that entire legacy. I get that. I remember when I first moved to LA, I started working for Sony Pictures, and I remember the first time I ever walked into the Sony lot. The Sony lot is the old MGM lot, and I'm
Mm,
just walking around thinking like, oh my God, like I'm in Hollywood. Like I'm really
yeah.
in Hollywood.
Well, and New York City is like that too. I mean, when I moved to New York in the 1980s, I just walked the streets of New York as a poor acting kid and would just my jaw would drop in front of the big public library because I recognized the lions from Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
One of my favorite movies at the time was After Dark, Martin Scorsese black comedy that's about New York in the late 80s and or yeah, in the 1980s. And it's if you haven't seen that film, it's really great, but it's also just filled with the sights and sounds of New York that looked exactly like the city looked when I first moved there.
Yeah.
And one of my first jobs in grad school was working at a video store in Times Square called King Carroll. So I got to
Okay.
meet a lot of really interesting folks during that period, um, including Bill Cosby and Jeffrey Holder, who were regular customers of mine because we had a selection of old black Hollywood films. I don't know if you know this, but in the 30s and 40s, they would often shoot a movie, and then because the southern United States had separated white theaters and black theaters, they
Yeah,
would
they
they would
like cut
reshoot
out
the
pieces.
film with the same script, but with an all-black cast. And
Oh,
not many of those have survived, but a few have. Maybe more are around now. But we had a collection of those films, and so we had a lot of notable customers who came in that were interested in that line.
yeah.
So
That's such a. I always think of jobs like that, like folks back when you had video stores, and I think about like when you had record stores, and you'd go in and you'd talk to somebody behind the counter and say like, "Yeah, I'm really a fan of this person." They'd be like, "Wait, come over here to this aisle. I gotta show you something." Was
yeah.
it working? What was it like working in the video store like that? Were you just like kind of like watching movies all day and like really kind of nerding out on on everything that was available to you and at your fingertips?
Well, it was pretty interesting. It meant taking a lot of movies home and watching them and learning about maybe genres that I wasn't that interested in until I started working there. But
Was that,
I was
not to
also
interrupt you, but was that something that was required of the job, or was that
no,
something that you?
no, I can, well, I don't really remember if it was encouraged, but it certainly wasn't discouraged. And I was I was hoping to be a professional actor at that point, so it certainly felt like research, right? So it was good work to go home and watch movies and watch other actors. But that was also a period of transition because video stores hadn't been around that long. King Carroll started out as a record store, so it was half record store. There's a whole side that was vinyl, and then our half of the store was the video place. But video rentals back then, the industry didn't like them. They didn't like the fact that you weren't going to a movie theater and messing up their structure of making money with this home thing. Movies on a videotape were priced for rental. They weren't priced for people to buy movies and own their own movies at home, right? So
Mhm.
a movie, if you wanted to buy a movie, cost like $120 for one tape for one movie. because they were expected to rent it out and eventually make their money back on the rentals. But when I was working at King Carroll in 60, in 87, 88, uh, not 67, uh, that was during the transition period where mass market videos just started out. There was like Top
Okay.
Gun came out and was marketed at 24.95 in the hope that people would want to own it.
Yeah.
And they
Which
did.
really is still a lot of money if you think 1987. Like that's probably like the equivalent of like buying a DVD at like $45 or
Oh,
something.
sure. But that was also the time when people were starting, the TVs were starting to get a little bigger and more
Hmm.
affordable. Home stereo was just kind of becoming a thing that you would actually plug your beta deck or your VHS deck into an actual amplifier with stereo separation. I think Return of the was it? It's probably Empire Strikes Back was the first movie I ever saw at home that had a stereo soundtrack, and you could hear
Yeah.
the separation of the stereo, and that was like a really big thing. So
We
if
were one of those
people were
households.
spending money on that, they would certainly spend 24.95 on a copy of Top Gun.
Yeah, total. We were one of those households. My father was really, really passionate. He didn't work in entertainment, but he was really, really passionate about like audio visual. Like he was like, we were very much an early adopter of that. And like
Hmm.
had the receiver and like the surround sound and yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then the Thriller tape came out, and that was $20, I think, and it sold a jillion copies. Um, and then Lionel Richie was convinced he could do the same thing, and he produced a video called "Dancing on the Ceiling,"
Loved it.
and it was great. But he also came out with a videotape of behind the scenes of that and brought that to market for 1995, and it did not sell gangbusters. So that was one of the first times that a video store ended up with crates and crates of unsold videotapes, taking up room. And that became kind of part of figuring out that whole period was storing stuff. When you go from being a rental place where you needed one or two copies to a sales place where you need boxes of tapes that you're planning to resell, it requires a different kind of a footprint.
Was the
But
video market, and I mean, maybe you may not know just because it wasn't your responsibility, but was the video market at that time similar to how like the record market was in the sense of, we order all these copies and like a year later, none of these sell. We send them all back to the record label and get our money back, or were you guys just stuck with them?
no, there were distribution centers uh, that would take stuff back for sure. Um, but you're right. I wasn't really that involved in the business side of things. I just basically was, I was a customer facing guy who gave recommendations. I know I introduced a lot of people to the Coen brothers, and I introduced a lot of people to the Terminator films. Um, People who just came in and couldn't believe that a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger as a robot would be any good, and then they come back and say this is the greatest thing I ever saw. Um, it was a really interesting time. It was a really interesting time. There was no obviously there was no internet. I mean, most people's experience with taking in that kind of media was going to theaters, and you saw whatever was in the theater that week, or you waited to see what they brought to TV, and we didn't. I mean, cable was around by then, so you had HBO and Cinemax and a couple
And
of couple of
Showtime. You said
movie channels.
Showtime. You had
Yeah.
Showtime still. Yeah. I remember because if I think about it, again, talking about like how my father was very much into audio visual. I remember we had so many movies, like when I was young in the 80s, but almost all of them were recorded from HBO and and showed like I think all of them were actually. Now when I think back to it, it was nothing but a bunch of like Betamax tapes with the little label on it and like two movies on each beta. And then once we moved to VHS, we could get three movies on.
Yeah. Yeah, if you use the slow mode, because
Exactly.
you had the high quality mode, and then you had the slow mode that would allow you to get like 6 hours on a tape. Um, it looked like it just looked terrible. Were you one of those households where your dad built a custom wall and you had the whole wall filled with tapes from floor to
With
ceiling,
yes, videos and also
color coded?
music. Oh my
Oh, and
goodness!
music.
I'll give yes, and I'll give you my worst color coded story, and then we'll go back to you. I remember, so we had when once CDs became the thing. I remember one because literally it was wall to wall media. That's all there was, and we had just floor to ceiling CDs. We had a huge CD collection, like hundreds of. Maybe we have it close to 1,000 at one point, like at some point, like in like the mid to late '90s. And I remember he embarked on this project, and he pulled me into it. And it's like he's like, we're gonna alphabetize all of these CDs. So we spent like an entire weekend alphabetizing all of these CDs and putting them into their slots. And like a week and a half later, it was my birthday, and my cousin bought me Aaliyah's first CD. And of course, Aaliyah spells her name AALY.
You always knew where to find your CD. It was first one in the list from that point on.
But exactly, but I had to then go and like one by one move each CD down a
Oh,
slot and over because we had
because you had
just
them packed in
alphabetized.
all the way with no wiggle room.
Yes, we
Yes.
had we had just. I'll never forget that we had just alphabetized everything, and then like that next week, I get the number one CD. But anyways, I
What
digress. No.
was your father a sort of naturally OCD person in general, or was this just a flash of insight that it would be nice to have them alphabetized?
I think that that's what it was. I think it got to the point where he got so sick of like, well, because you know where things are when you put them. But after a while, there were so many of them. It's like, you know what? We should alphabetize these. Let's do that. And so,
Okay. Yeah, I have a friend who's a bit OCD, and when we were in, he was also in our class in grad school with Evie, and he had the wall in his apartment with all of his CDs and all of his beta tapes, because of course he had to have beta, not VHS, because the quality's a little better, right? And they were all very, very, carefully and beautifully labeled and color coded and alphabetized, so he always knew where everything was.
yeah. No, my
I
father's not
was not
OCD at
that
all.
person.
And once it was done, it was actually wonderful because you could just, but what are you going to do? So tell me, so you started out as an actor. So like what sparked that? Were you like a child actor? Were you or like was it something that you wanted to do and your parents indulged you in as a kid and then it grew? Or was there like this one movie where you were like, oh my God, that I want to be Arnold Schwarzenegger as a robot?
I think I just sort of I liked showing off. I liked making people laugh. I was a little bit of a class clown in high school and junior high. Well, especially junior high. I did some shows in high school that were not great, but it was fun to be on stage. But it was not the best theater. It wasn't the best theater department. It's certainly not like high school theater is now, where stuff is really beautifully produced. This was very much a sort of thrown together thing. We do a musical, but instead of having an orchestra proper, you'd have the band could come in and play. So it was like heavy emphasis on brass, which doesn't really necessarily support musical theater as well as like strings. Um,
I mean, I
but
was picturing like Oklahoma with the 8 saxophones. Like,
there was a great theater scene in Memphis, and I went and saw a production of Christmas Carol with an actor who was well known in Memphis, who recently passed actually. Guy named Barry Fuller, very funny, very brilliant guy who had somehow grown up an actor in Australia and ended up as a travel agent in Memphis, who worked in community theater, and he was absolutely brilliant. And when I went to college to go to med school, to do pre-med at Rhodes College in Memphis. And they also, my freshman year, opened a new theater there called the McCoy Theater. And the McCoy Theater's opening production was going to be Candide, and it was uh, going to be directed by Barry Fuller, this guy that I had seen. And it was like, well, I can't not try out for that because he's so great. Wouldn't this be fun? I like theater. I'll be in the chorus of this show. And a year later, I was a theater major and not in med pre-med anymore. Um, and it was a bug that absolutely got me. And I did within the first couple of years, I had done more shows than anyone in the theater department had actually done. So it was time to change my major. And then,
How did that go
after,
over with the folks? Like, this
my
pre-med thing
parents
has been
were
really good.
always, I can't say the same about my siblings, but my parents were always really supportive of whatever choices I made. Um, and I did have one brother who came in and helped with lights and kind of really appreciated the sort of whole theater vibe. My parents, I think, were I don't know, they were proud. They enjoyed the shows as well. They loved theater, and it seemed to be something I was okay at. I know they worried about, can you make a living doing this? Um, the answer to that is for most people, no, unfortunately. But I was accomplished enough that I got some good roles in some good shows and got to be kind of a big fish in that pond, the pond of Memphis theater. And then New York company from Circle in the Square came to Memphis to do some auditions for a scholarship for um, their 2-year professional workshop on Broadway. And I did not win the scholarship, but I did get invited to attend the school on my own dime, which I did.
You won the opportunity to pay.
I won the opportunity, and I went the class was about 20 people, and um, it was great. Spent 2 years at the Paramount building, which was 2 blocks south of where I work now. So I'm on my old stomping grounds from the 1980s is actually my new stomping grounds where we're doing our cartoons,
You're a true Broadway baby, as they say.
as they say.
So at what point, how did the transition into visual effects come along?
Um,
Because that's a very specialized thing.
it is, and no such thing really existed to the average person when I was doing theater, certainly. Um, Visual effects were the very complicated, very expensive optical things that were done by a handful of really brilliant people like Douglas Trumbull and, of course, George Lucas's groups um, out in LA. But as you probably know, most people who call themselves actors do other work on the side to pay the bills while they're waiting for the next gig. And my side work was temp work, and my temp work was um, computers. And I happened to be comfortable with computers. My dad was a programmer, going back to the 1950s, back to the punch card days. Um, and when I worked at the video store I told you about earlier, I had a regular customer who came in with random pieces of computer hardware for sale, which I never asked him where he got them. But I ended up with a little IBM computer that was powerful enough to run a program called PageMaker and a program called CorelDRAW, eventually. And by playing around with that computer, I got comfortable enough to learn word processing and a little bit of database stuff, and then PageMaker and Corel. And I got temp work doing those things. I got a temp job at an engineering firm called Parsons Brinkerhoff, a very old firm who invented the subway like 100 years earlier. So they've been around for a long time. They were in Penn Station. And I worked there for several years. And because I was sort of an eager computer person, I got brought in to initially be a desktop publishing guy when most people were still doing traditional layout, literally cutting and pasting things to make a page and then taking a photograph of that and then printing that. They were transitioning from that to desktop publishing because that's when all of that was happening. And I got brought in to kind of be a part of that team. And then after a couple of years of that, it became clear that video was going to follow the same path. And desktop video was just starting while I was working there. And this was a company that routinely would bid on projects that were worth $1 billion or $2 billion, building bridges and tunnels and things. And so they had no problem at all throwing money at whatever new technology was coming out to try to sell these products to new customers.
So you've
And
actually been spending other people's money for a really long time. It was
I
it
was I
was
was able during that period, I was able to um yeah, spend other people's money to basically help me learn how to do all this stuff. And this was when it was all being invented. I mean, I've been working with Photoshop since version 1 when it came bundled with a scanner. It was called Barney Scan. Um, and After Effects version 1 and a lot of these Adobe products that eventually got either purchased by Adobe or developed by Adobe. I was, there from the get-go with a lot of them. And a few years after that, I went out on my own and recognized that as an actor, I could communicate. And as a technical person, I knew a lot about software that people were starting to use. And so I became a trainer. I went out and made some pretty extensive videotapes on how to use After Effects. Um, and those were extremely successful. I mean, beyond my wildest dreams. There wasn't anything else like it on the market, and everybody wanted to learn After Effects, and so we did really well with that product. Well enough that I was able to make a little software company and start writing our own plugins for After Effects, and then Adobe liked those plugins and acquired them. Um, and so I've had a relationship with that team now for many years, and it was all of that journey. It was all of that part of my life that sort of led me to animation and post-production and actually being not just somebody who makes the tools or shows people how they work, but somebody who actually does them.
Yeah.
You know,
I
it's a
love how
con.
it's like the full circle. Like it's
Yeah.
all of the acting you did, all of the technical things that you learned, and also your experience in home video. And like here you are. Yeah.
Here I am. Yeah,
And here you are, yeah.
it's been a trip. Um, the training
So
company ultimately belly flopped. It didn't belly flop. It didn't survive the Great Recession of 2007. It hung on for a few years after that, but eventually it went out of business, and I was sort of left on my own, trying to find another thing um, to grasp onto, and struggling financially, and really kind of felt like I lost my way. And some members of the original After Effects team, Dave Simons and Dan Wilk and some of their team members, broke off of After Effects to create this new software package called Character Animator. And it originally was a very bare bones alpha, and I was one of the first people that they approached to play with it a little bit. And my wife and I used it to make a little Christmas card where we sang a song and made some little puppets. And I think that was the first thing that was ever produced with Character Animator. And then about a year and a half later, I was invited to do a speech that you can find on YouTube at NAB, um, where I gave a fairly traditional PowerPoint presentation, but I designed a character animator series of puppets that were the slides. And so I basically gave a speech where the presentation came to life and took over and sort of psychoanalyzed me on stage. And it became like a really it was a very popular thing. And that process, which was attended by the character animator team, led them to introduce me rather, to Tim Lukey, who was working for Colbert at the time. And Tim had created an animation with Character Animator for the election special in 2016, and
mhm.
that became a pilot of sorts for the idea for a TV series for Showtime that was going to be called Our Cartoon President. And Adobe, basically based on our history, told Tim, you need to hire this guy because he has the experience you need to be able to get this thing off the ground. And so that's how we were introduced. And that's how I got to where I am now, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. Do you still act at all? Do you still have that bug?
I was starting to get back into it again before I started working at the Ed Sullivan. Um, I did a couple of shows. A friend of mine is a playwright, and we did a show in New York, and then we took it to Nashville for a little while. And then we did a couple productions in New York of a show about alcoholism called Bill W. and Dr. Bob, where I played Dr. Bob. Um, and odds and ends here and there, but once I got sort of immersed in being a technical director on a TV show, that sort of became my life, and I haven't done any acting since then. So not for the last 7 years.
Yeah, well, it's a full-time job, especially if you're trying to put together an animated show, a live daily animated show in six
Uh,
months.
it gets worse than that even, because by the time we were around shutting everything down for COVID, we actually had three shows going at the same
Oh my
time,
God.
not just one. And I was technical director on all of them.
Wow.
And about 2 months before we shut down, Frank Oz walked into my office to borrow a USB cable, and I said, "You're Frank Oz,"
As
and
it
he
as
said,
as
"Yes,
as
I
it
am."
hap as he
As
does.
it happens, and I find out that Colbert is producing a film for Frank Oz called In and of Itself, and they need some animation, and he was coming to talk to Tim about it. And as soon as I had the opportunity, I said, "Tim, I have to work on this." So the poster that's behind me on the wall that your listeners can't see is for that film, and that went on to get a perfect 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. So that was a really, really fun thing to
Yeah.
be involved in. It was a great film. If people haven't seen it, they really should watch it. It's on Hulu. Um, but yeah, that was a very busy time working on multiple shows at the same time. So certainly, uh, uh, yeah, it was too much time to also be a part-time actor on the side.
Yeah, but it's fun. I actually, for the first time in I want to say 20 years, a few months ago, I decided to take a Meisner class, and I hadn't been like in a classroom setting in so long. It was so fun, and I was like, oh my goodness, I remember why I used to really love doing it, and I also thought it was so interesting because, being my age now versus like say like in high school or college age, there was so much that I was able like that I took from it that could be applied to just like my daily life that like 20 some odd years ago like I totally wasn't even cognizant of.
100%. And when people, I have very little patience for people who make fun of education in the arts, particularly theater. Um, there's a lot of um, I mean, there's a lot of areas of study you could make fun of, but I have never in my life regretted being able to confidently communicate. I've
Mm-hmm.
never regretted being able to stand up in front of a group of people and talk and not be afraid. Theater teaches you skills, gives you skills that no matter what you decide to do with life, those skills will be useful to you in some way. And so, yeah, that I have no regrets in terms of that part of my background. Um,
Yeah.
Theater ultimately gave me everything, I think, because, everything that I chose to do, whatever field I went into, was a you know, it either called on or was a straightforward variation on the stuff that I learned in on the stage and in grad school.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever thought about, or like recently, like having your background and now having this, being a, as your career as a technical director and working on some really interesting projects and doing it very successfully and having previously, um, had these training videos. Have you ever thought about and being a communicator and naturally a performer? Have you thought about teaching in some aspect, whether that's, like actually in academia or, you know, sort of what you did previously, like, oh, you know what, let me
I
set
actually
up my own.
have done that. In fact, my first training tapes came out of about a year of doing live training. in After Effects um, in New York City. And when I was fresh out of grad school, one of my first jobs in the city was teaching ESL. I taught Russian emigres how to speak English for a while. Um, that was the hardest work I think I've ever done. It's exhausting. Um, I don't know if you've ever
Teaching or
done,
teaching Russian immigrants?
yeah,
I'm saying teaching was the hardest thing you've ever done.
the teaching
Hmm.
period,
Yeah.
because um, and maybe this was a byproduct of being an actor and being taught how to be an extemporaneous performer or whatever, but it always felt like um, it feels a little bit like theater. You're standing in front of a group of people, you're trying to engage them, you're trying to entertain them in a way. I mean, that's especially teaching ESL. You're often dealing with people who don't understand the language at all, so it becomes very physical. You're trying to
Hmm.
pantomime things basically to get ideas across. You're constantly evaluating and editing what you're saying and what you're thinking to try to make the message effective. It's just mentally draining. It's exhausting. I would go home and just crash
Because
and
you're on,
yeah,
like
you're
you're
on for
on. Yeah.
for long days. I mean, you could be on your feet for 8 hours with different groups, and it was tough. It was really tough work. I mean, I've certainly done when I was younger. I certainly did physical labor that was harder, but that kind of performance is mentally very draining for that length of time.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know. I've kicked around the idea of maybe putting a podcast together, which might be a sort of return to form. I know a lot of industry people and have been through quite a bit to get where I am now, and I think that there's a structure there somewhere that could, I think, bring interesting stories every week related to production and how we got to where we are in the industry now, and um,
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something earlier, which has been a conversation that I've had with a lot of different people, both here on the show, but also just in my daily life, about how the industry is going through this really massive shift right now, and just kind of the old way of doing things. Whether that's how you actually create the content, whether it's how content is distributed, whether it's like we're kind of moving into just something new, and I think that no one quite knows exactly how that's going to land. How are you feeling about what you're seeing happen in the industry, whether it's streaming and we're seeing streaming, they're even talking about basically going back to the cable model with streaming, like having a single streamer for all of the studios, and the advent of AI. Like how are you feeling about where the business is and the future of it, which is a very broad question, I realize,
it
so I
is an incredibly
apologize.
broad question. It is an
I,
incredibly broad question, yes, and I'm I I will admit that I am a bit pessimistic about it, which is very unusual for me because I tend to be a glass half full, bright side kind of person. But I think that the technological advances in the industry are a constant. Everything is always changing and evolving to make things more efficient and give artists more creativity and move things forward. We could have a separate hour-long conversation about AI fitting into that and how I feel about that, but I think you've had other guests that have covered that, so I won't. But I think the part of the industry that is frankly responsible for where we are right now is this idea of infinite growth.
Mm-hmm.
That instead of 20 studios, we now have like two or three companies that own everything. And they don't really care about art or creativity. They care about growth, not even profits, not even how much money they're making, but how much more money they're making this year than they made last year. Because without growth, their stock doesn't go up. And if their stock doesn't go up, they can't buy another yacht. And those people making those decisions, I think, are responsible for why we are where we are right now, which is a strike that lasted for months, that shut down industries and shut down shows and threw countless people out of work that are still struggling and trying to find their way back into this industry, or just giving up and looking elsewhere, which is a tragedy. Because I think essentially uninformed, ambitious people who are trying to make their company bigger and make their bottom line bigger, making decisions based around technologies that don't exist yet. You've got a whole middle management layer saying, "Oh, we're just going to do all of this with AI." I know I said I wasn't going to do anything to talk about AI, but this is like, I think, an important part of it. Business plans are being built around AI. Well, guess what? AI is not ready yet.
Mm-hmm.
So they're like putting whole teams in to come in and do prompting to try to create stuff. And it's like, all right, great. Here's a woman in a pink dress in the woods with blonde hair, and she's smiling. And okay, great. Now have her do this, and you have her do this, and it's sort of like what you want. But now you want to edit it. Now you want to change it. Now you want to make it the thing that a director needs to do to direct. And the AI doesn't come back with that tiny, small adjustment. It comes up with a new version.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the pink is different, or maybe the hairstyle is a little bit different, or maybe she has extra, everybody jokes about extra digits or whatever, or free hands. But um, at the end of the day, AI is not ready as a production tool. It is simply not. It can do stills, and everyone's learning to recognize those stills as AI. And part of that recognition leads to people not valuing those results, because AI is essentially at this point, and I'm not talking about writing. I'm talking about visuals, because that's really where I exist the most. AI is glorified high-tech clip art at this point. It is a way to sort of get something that's close to what you want with a minimal amount of effort, which is very, very different than what artists do.
Mm-hmm.
I used to joke at late night cartoons that the most inspirational thing I could do is go to the bathroom. Because to get to the bathroom, I had to walk through a room full of artists hunched over their Wacom tablets, drawing extraordinary art, people creating amazing characters or beautiful backgrounds, and just watching those things evolve and develop, and know that they were coming out of these artists' heads in response to directives that they had been given, that they knew that they needed to create an image of downtown DC that needed to sort of fit within the confines of the visual language of the show, right? It had the cars look like this, and people look like this, and the thickness of the line is this, and the color palette is this, and it's nighttime, not daytime. And all of these directions infuse what's produced, and the 10 people that produce 10 different backgrounds, you can cut between those backgrounds, and they cut together perfectly and beautifully, because they were following these instructions and these directives that led them to that result. You don't get that yet from AI. And I don't know why they want to, other than to save money. And that's
Mm-hmm.
ultimately what kills me, is that all of this effort, all of this expense, all of this electricity is being spent to ultimately take money away from the artists who've studied their entire lives and give it to the people at the top, because now they don't have to pay those artists anymore. And I really struggle with that. I honestly hate that. I hate it, because I know those artists and have worked with them for years. And it kills me to see so many talented people out of work, sitting on their hands, or giving it up altogether
Mm-hmm.
and going to work somewhere else, because now there just isn't there aren't any jobs out there in this. And it's all inspired by that. Sure, the tech is cool, but it's all inspired by this pursuit of growth, this pursuit that this year we have to show more profits than we showed last year, or our
Yeah.
stock price will go down. And that's the only thing that matters.
Well, as much as I hate to end on such a downer.
Oh my God, I brought the mood down, but this is.
No, this is wonderful. I think I really enjoyed getting acquainted with you and getting to learn about you, about where you've been, and also just your philosophy on things. Because I don't think you are wrong at all. Here's hoping. That's all I'll say. Here's hoping. But it's been really wonderful chatting with you. Can our listeners find you
You can
and
find me
see what you're up to?
I have a Twitter account that's B Maffitt, BMAFFITT, two F's, two T's. Had a website under construction for 7 years now, so no need to get
Well,
that out.
it's okay. The best things come to those who wait.
Yeah. Been busy.
Well, exactly. You've been technical directing 3 shows and working with Frank Oz. Got a lot of stuff to do.
I can't complain.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
An absolute pleasure. It's nice to meet you.
Absolutely. And thank you all out there for listening. And we'll talk to you next week on another episode of Showtime with Jordan Van Hassel and Friends, right here on Hot 702.5 FM, Las Vegas.